Hello class, this is going to be your world history video for Wednesday and Thursday. There's not a whole lot of detail in some of these pages, so it should be pretty short watch, pretty short read. Today we're going to start off on page 413 in your books. Sorry if you hear my neighbor, she's like hollering down here. She's a little girl. Anyway, so we're going to talk about first the growth of the the United States. And so the way that America grew during the 1800s was President Thomas Jefferson had the Louisiana Purchase, which doubled the size of land that America owned. And also another country that was increasing was England, Great Britain. They had lots of colonies, lots of places. Ireland, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa were all under British rule at that point. So, sorry, I'm just grabbing my book here. Ireland was finally received independence shortly after World War I, but before World War I, it was in under the control of England. They were very split. The top half of England was Protestant, south half was Roman Catholic, so they had these problems anyway that didn't really help that the British were over them. Canada had the Quebec Act in 1774 that allowed the people in the Quebec area, which is a French area, to keep their French language, keep their laws, and keep Roman Catholicism as their main religion, even though the Church of England was Protestant. So if you ever talk to somebody that's French, or Canadian, kind of like in Louisiana, it's kind of the same way. There's a lot of French people down there. Obviously, there's the French quarters in New Orleans. And obviously, Orleans is a French name, as we've seen the Duke of Orleans in France before. If you talk to them, I met a lady when I was in Dollywood once, that they came from Canada, and she was bilingual, and she had always been bilingual. She spoke both English and French because she was from the Quebec area. So a lot of them speak both languages, and even today they have the British Columbia, and they have a lot of things that reflect England. At Disney World, they used to have in the Canadian area actually a phone booth that looked like a British phone booth, like one of those red British phone booths. They had one in the Canadian area. They have a prime minister, very similar to how England has a prime minister. So Australia was actually founded the first person to explore it was James Cook, and but for many years, even though it's a pretty large area of land, it was actually kind of not founded. Obviously, there's a lot of different geography and landscapes in Australia. There's the outback, which is dry and has kangaroos, and it's cute. And there's like the area of Sydney that's like very metropolitan and has waterways. You can see it there at the bottom of your page on page 417. I always think of Finding Nemo when I think of Australia, so that's what I always think of. I was just looking here to make sure I get through everything I need to. New Zealand was actually where the convicts of Australia went to live. So if you were a convict and you were convicted in Australia, they just sent you to live in New Zealand, which sounds like, oh, it must be an awful place, but it's actually beautiful. It's where Lord of the Rings was filmed. They have a little hobbit area in New Zealand. I've seen pictures of it. I've never actually been there. And the South Africa, as you guys know, my teacher in communications, I talk about him all the time. I love him dearly, Mr. Palmer. He was from South Africa, and it was so funny because when you think of people in South Africa, you think of, typically, when you think of people in Africa in general, you just think of darker skinned people. And there was a guy in my class that he was an African American, and Mr. Palmer looked at him the first day of class, and he was like, "We're both Africans, like, this is good, like, we're brothers." And and the guy was like, "What?" Because he was very white skinned, but actually South Africa has a large, very pale white population. And there was a Disney movie made when I was a kid, so years ago, like early 2000s, that was called The Color of Friendship. and this little girl from South Africa came to live with a black family in America, and they were like really shocked that she was white, and she was like, we're all white in South Africa. She was like, it's the majority of us are white there. So there's like this misconception that like everybody that's African is dark skinned or from dark skinned descent. So now we're moving on to a little bit to the impact of missionaries. So the first one we're starting with is William Carey, and he was very, very smart, and he learned all these languages as a child, and he was very, as a young person, he was very interested in the Bible, even from a very young age, and something that he like coined the phrase of in it was his plea for missions was expect great things from God and attempt great things for God. I love that. I think that's so wonderful. And I think it's so cool that your book has this in there, this history on missions. It's something that honestly I don't know a whole lot about. Sadly, it wasn't ever really taught to me. There is a missions minor at Bryan, but I did not take those classes, so it's kind of sad that I didn't. He ended up going to India though, and he was very dedicated to the Indian people. He ended up translating 20 he ended up translating Bibles into 20 different Indian dialects, and so that's so that way the gospel would be spread to the Indian people, and ended up overseeing 20 more dialects being overseen where he could help translate those. In China, one that's I'm a little bit more familiar with is J. Hudson Taylor. Fun fact, where I grew up in church when I was a little girl, all the way till I got older, went off my senior year, right before I went to college. Where I grew up as a little girl, the pastor named his son Hudson after Hudson Taylor. Fun fact. So Hudson Taylor was he devoted himself to God and wanted to be a missionary, and ended up going to China to be a missionary, and he could only work on the coast, but he was very burdened for the people on the inland, and he saw how they lived, and he knew that they needed that, so he ended up making like a foundation for them, and he went and worked in China for a while, and he got really sick. He had to go back to England where he was from, and eventually him and his wife and family moved back to China, and Taylor, who had once asked the Lord for 24 collaborators, now prayed for 1,000, and God answered his request. So at one point he prayed that 24 people would go work in China, and then he ended up praying for 1,000. So he set up this fund for people to be able to go do that. So we're moving on a little bit to Japan, which is kind of off the idea of missionaries, just like in Japan in general. We've talked a lot about China, but we've not talked a whole lot about Japan, so I thought it'd be kind of cool if we just added this in here. Sorry, my eye is really bothering me. Sorry. Okay. Japan actually had a feudal society, which if you remember what feudal means, it's this idea of different levels of people in different classes, and obviously at some level we still all have that. There is people who are on poverty level and middle class and the upper class, even in America, but this was more the idea of, think back to, medieval times here, of what we call peasants. And then the nobles being on top. That's kind of this same idea, so think back to that. And they really didn't want Western influence into their area, but Matthew Perry, a U.S. naval commander, ended up sailing there, and there ended up being an open trade between America and Japan, which we'd had some problems even post-Civil War trading with China, and so in any Asian area, they really didn't want the influence of the West into their Eastern culture of peace and Zen, and we take things, we're very family oriented, and we've talked about this before. Westernized culture is very, I'm independent, I do my job, I want to get my job done, go, 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 and Eastern culture is more family oriented, it's communal living. The idea of living individualized lives isn't really an idea that they would accept. They still worship their ancestors when they die, so it's a very communal, family-oriented, bring peace and honor to your family kind of environment, whereas in America, it's go out and make a name for yourself, and most Western culture, like Europe and America, it's like go, 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 hard work, put your boots on, strap your boots up and go. And so that's kind of, they didn't want that involved in their Zen lifestyle or in their family-oriented lifestyle. So there ended up being this ability, though, for Japan and America to be able to trade a little bit. And but Japan finally became from a feudal society to an industrial society under the Meiji period. And so they ended up adopting some Western ways, and obviously they kind of ended up getting a little upset at the Westerns of Western nations during World War II. So we're about to dive into that. So I just hold on to that thought for a little while, because we're headed there. We're headed right towards World War I, World War II. So just hold on, we're getting there. But for a long period of time, the East did their thing and the West did their thing, and there wasn't a whole lot of cross in between. It was just kind of like, we do our thing, we don't want anything involved with you guys, and you do you, we're gonna do us. So, but that's all about to change in the next little bit. And we know now there's a lot of immigration back and forth. People from America move to China. We trade with China constantly. We trade with Taiwan and the Philippines, and we have a pretty good relationship with Japan, and so in China, even though that one's kind of wonky right now, but there's a lot of trade that goes back and forth between the two, so it's not that way anymore, but for a long period of time it was. So that is all for this week. I'm going to send you guys lots of videos and stuff to watch, so you guys can play with the text and look through it and see and interact with it in a more kind of realistic way that would probably relate to your lives a little bit more, to where you guys, it's interesting and fun. So all right, I hope you guys have a good week.